Okay, this is the unit on vowels, and I'm going to start with an overview of the vocal tract. I've drawn a slightly less pathetic looking human head over here with the vocal tract indicated. Oh gosh, I forgot the tongue. That's actually super important as it turns out. Okay, how are we going to do that? Let's get that tongue in there. Cool. That's a kind of funny looking tongue, but whatever. It's pretty small. The real tongue is actually bigger than that, but let's call that a tongue. Okay. And you have a real image of a human vocal tract on your handout here under the number 1. That image is a magnetic resonance image. It's of my teacher, Adam Albright, actually. It's his head. And you have the different parts of the vocal tract marked off in there. Of course, real images of real human heads are pretty complicated and it can be pretty hard to see things, so it's often useful to use these much simpler and more abstract images that you just draw, where you're trying to highlight all the different parts. Not completely realistic, but it's useful for seeing the different parts that we're talking about. So let's start from the front of the vocal tract and we'll work our way backwards. One of the most important pieces of anatomy that you use to produce sound are your lips, right? So we've got an upper lip and a lower lip. You can bring your two lips together as a sound like pa, right? Or you can round them, you can protrude them, you do a lot of things with your lips. Behind the lips you have your teeth, your upper and lower teeth, and you'll often position your tongue or your lips with regard to the teeth to make certain sounds. So these are involved in sound formation. And then once we get behind there are some less well-known or intuitive kinds of structures in here. And so in particular, if you go behind your teeth with the tip of your tongue, you'll feel just behind your teeth a little bump here. Try that. You feel that bump just behind your teeth? That's your alveolar ridge or alveolar ridge. I usually say alveolar, which is unfortunate because it sounds a lot like velar, which we'll get to in a minute, but either pronunciation is fine. That's your alveolar ridge, and right behind the alveolar ridge, you'll be able to feel the roof of your mouth is hard, and that's referred to as your hard palate. So going back beyond your alveolar ridge with your tongue tip, you'll feel your hard palate. And if you keep going back until you start to get kind of uncomfortable, and maybe it makes you nauseous or something, you'll feel that the roof of your mouth begins to soften. So if you get your tongue tipped back just about as far as it can go, you'll feel it start to get soft around here. And that's your soft palate, which is also referred to as your velum. Okay? Now the velum is going to be like this whole back part of the palate, including this rearmost tip of the palate, which is called your uvula. So the uvula is a part of the velum. When you make a nasal sound, I'm sorry, there's a truck going by. Okay, truck's gone. When you make a nasal sound, where air flows through your nasal cavity, this is your nasal cavity up here, right? It comes out your nose, and it's connected to your oral cavity through this port. This is called the velopharyngeal port, and the way you open the port is by taking your velum and lowering it. The way you close the port is by taking your velum and raising it, right? So there's no space here. So you can either couple or uncouple the oral and the nasal cavities. You do that using your velum, your soft palate. Right? So yeah, this is the nasal cavity, as I said earlier. What else do we have here? Right, the tongue. So I already mentioned your tongue tip. That's used all the time in speech, and the tip of the tongue is sometimes referred to as the corona, or the front part of the tongue can be referred to as the corona or coronal sounds, which are made with that front part. They can also be called apical. That refers to really just the very front tip of the tongue. The area immediately behind the tip that's still on the front of the tongue is referred to as the blade, the tongue blade. You go a little bit further back in the tongue in this sort of mid area here that you might raise up to your palate. That's referred to as the tongue body or dorsum. So same thing, tongue body, tongue dorsum. Dorsum is just Latin for I don't know what it's Latin for, but it's your tongue body, right? The furthest back part of your tongue that's down in your throat here is referred to as your tongue root. And that also features in sound production. We probably won't spend as much time on radical sounds, sounds produced with your root this semester, but the tongue root is definitely relevant to a lot of different sounds. So we tend to split the tongue into at least these three different areas: the the root, the dorsum, and the corona. So coronal sounds, dorsal sounds, radical sounds. And okay, so going back, we're getting really far back in your vocal tract now here. We said that this port between the nasal cavity and the oral cavity is the velopharyngeal port. Why is that? Well, the soft palate is the velum, and this column of air back in your throat here is referred to as your pharynx. The pharynx is not a piece of tissue or anything. It's the cavity that's back here in your throat. That's the pharynx. So that's why this is the velopharyngeal port. It's the port that the velum is in the vicinity of the velum and the pharynx, which is this whole back cavity here. The pharynx is the cavity immediately above this guy, and this is what's going to be important in the first part of this handout. This is a set of two pieces of tissue that you can bring together or you can separate, so there's a hole in between them. And it's actually contained in a whole bunch of cartilage and everything. The entire structure altogether is referred to as the larynx. And just the kind of hole in the middle of these two pieces of tissue is called the glottis. We're going to use the terms larynx and glottis interchangeably in this class, and we're also going to refer to these pieces of tissue as the vocal folds, right? So in principle, there's a slight difference between what are the vocal folds, what is the glottis, and what is the larynx, but we're basically going to use all of them interchangeably in here. And so you can refer to sounds that use this as laryngeal features or glottal features or anything like that. And so we're going to be talking about the glottis and the vocal folds when we talk about vowels, and I'll explain why in the next video.